Okay, so now we'll look at some versions of the cosmological argument. I've introduced you to arguments for and against God's existence. We've looked at some, preliminary considerations when it comes to cosmological arguments, such as the concept of self-existence and the concept of dependence, as well as the principle of sufficient reason. So now we'll actually look at William Lane Craig's Coulomb cosmological argument, as well as Clarke's cosmological argument. And we'll look at Clarke's cosmological argument through the lens of William Rowe. William Rowe has done extensive work on the cosmological argument, so we'll follow that. First, let's look at the Coulomb. So Coulomb is a particular school of Islamic philosophy. So the origin of this argument is Islam. So the first proponents were Muslim philosophers, Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali. So it's a very old argument. And a contemporary proponent is William Lane Craig, and he's spent a good portion of his career writing about, researching, and defending the Coulomb cosmological argument, and even at a popular level through debates and lectures on university campuses. So it relies on a weak version of the principle of sufficient reason. By weak, I don't mean, not as strong. I mean one that doesn't claim as much, one that's more conservative. Okay, so the claim is everything that begins to exist has a cause. So it's not making a claim that everything that exists has a cause, just everything that begins to exist has a cause. And it's silent about those things that don't begin to exist, whether or not they have a cause. So let's look at the argument. Number one, and here's the principle of sufficient reason. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. Number two, the universe began to exist, so therefore the universe has a cause. What do you think? Is this argument good? So it's definitely valid, right? Like if anything that begins to exist has a cause and the universe begins to exist, it totally follows that the universe has a cause. So the question we need to ask is this: are the premises true? So what do you think of the argument? Is it good, it's not good, or you're not sure? I'd like to hear from you. So premise one seems right. At least if it's true that you can't get something from nothing, and that seems very reasonable. And premise two relies on the universe having a beginning, which is plausible given the Big Bang. And so the conclusion follows. It's sound. The conclusion definitely follows, and the premises are true. Or at least the premises are more reasonable to believe than their denial. One criticism people have had of this argument is that the conclusion doesn't get you far enough, right? Aren't we trying to give arguments for God's existence? And didn't we define God as omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect? But look at the conclusion of the argument. It's just that the universe has a cause. But it doesn't say anything about what the cause is like. Is this cause morally good? I don't know. I can't tell that it is good just based on this argument. I can tell that it produced the universe. Is this being all-powerful? I don't know. It's powerful enough to produce a universe. That's pretty dang powerful, but is it all powerful? Like, as powerful as logically possible, right? So that's a criticism people have had of this argument. And William Lane Craig, he tries to respond to those criticisms, and he basically like you can divide up the argument into two stages. So first you establish that the universe has a cause, and then you give another argument or series of arguments to show what that cause is like, right? So you can't just stop at number 3. You have to carry the argument further. So suppose that this argument is logically sound, meaning the conclusion follows and the premises are true. Well, that's pretty remarkable, isn't it? That using a logical argument, we can show that there's something beyond the universe. I don't know, that's pretty impressive to me. Then you look at then we'll consider Clarke's cosmological argument. So here's the argument via William Rowe. Every individual being that exists or did exist is either a dependent being or a self-existent being. Not every being can be dependent, so there's at least one self-existent being. Now, we did define dependent being and self-existent being in a previous lecture. You can go back to that. Cosmological Arguments Part 1. But I can briefly say what they mean here. So a dependent being is a being who is produced by the causal activity of some other being, whereas a self-existent being is a being that exists by the necessity of its own nature, right? So when we look at this argument, yes, it's valid, but are the premises true? So the conclusion does follow from the premises, but are the premises true? We need to investigate the premises. So what would be what would be a reason for thinking that premise 1 is true? Well, Samuel Clarke thinks that premise 1 is true because of the principle of sufficient reason. So if you wanted to divide up individual beings into their various categories, you would first divide them up into dependent beings and independent beings, and that would be mutually exclusive categories that are exhaustive. They exhaust the categories, dependent and independent. But you can divide up the independent beings into more than one category: self-existent beings and beings that have no explanation for their existence. So a self-existent being, again, has an explanation for its existence in the necessity of its own nature. And then an independent being has no explanation for its existence. We would call this a brute being, or it's a brute fact that this being exists. So if we look at the premise, it says every being is either dependent or self-existent, but don't we have this further category here of beings that have no explanation for their existence? Well, Samuel Clarke doesn't think so. Why? Because he thinks that there is no such thing. There can't be such a thing as a being with no explanation for its existence, because he believes in the principle of sufficient reason, that everything has a ground of its existence, a cause or a reason of its existence, right? So that would rule out any being that has no explanation for its existence. And therefore, every being really is either self-existent or dependent. And so premise 1 would be true. So it all depends on the principle of sufficient reason. What about premise? Oh yeah, there we go. It depends on the principle of sufficient reason that every being has a cause, a reason, or a ground for its existence. Premise 2, not every being can be dependent. And this one is not so easy to see why. But here it goes. If everything is dependent, there is no reason or explanation or ground for why dependent beings exist in the first place. But the principle of sufficient reason requires that everything has an explanation, even this series of dependent beings. All right, so where did you come from? You came from your parents. Where did they come from? They came from their parents. And you can just keep going back and keep going back. And every being that you mention, if we're just thinking that there's, if every being is dependent, every being that you mention will have some being outside of it that produces it, right? So then you have this just eternal chain of dependent beings. And yes, my existence is explained by what comes before me, and what comes before me is explained by what comes before them or it. And every being in that eternal chain of beings has an explanation, but the thing that doesn't have an explanation is why why they're dependent beings in the first place. Where did they come from in the first place, right? And for that, it can't just be another dependent being, right? Because that dependent being would have something that came before it that explains it. If it's going to have an explanation, then it's going to be either in a being that has no explanation for its existence or a self-existent being, right? Okay, so here's the argument. I wonder what objections you have to it. So every individual being that exists or did exist is either dependent or self-existent. Not every being can be dependent. Therefore, there exists a self-existent being. So think about it, consider what objections you might have, maybe comment on those objections in the discussion board, and yeah, in the meantime, we'll look at an objection for ourselves. So there are many important objections to the cosmological argument, but we won't take the time to go through them. You can. Here's an article you can read. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has an article on the cosmological argument, and various objections are given to the cosmological argument. What is William Rowe's objection to Clarke's cosmological argument? What he says is that the argument depends on the principle of sufficient reason, and that's definitely true. Both premises depend on the principle of sufficient reason. But, says Rowe, there is no reason to think that the principle of sufficient reason is true. So what Rowe is advocating here for is sort of, at the most, he's saying there are brute existences, beings that have no explanation for their existence. At the least, he's saying, I don't know. Are there brute existences? Are there not? And he leaves it open. Either way, he says, there's no reason to accept the principle of sufficient reason, which says that everything has a cause or a reason or an explanation, a ground of its existence, right? So earlier, in part one of the cosmological argument, the lecture that I gave, I cited rational intuition, everyday experience, and the scientific enterprise as some sort of prima facie reasons for accepting the principle of sufficient reason. So you just kind of gotta sift through those things for yourself. Do you think there is a reason for believing in the principle of sufficient reason or not? What's more rational, to accept it or to reject it, or to withhold judgment on it? And your answer to that question is, very telling, because if you do accept the principle of sufficient reason, you're going to have to conclude that there's something like God that exists. And if you somehow you think it's rational to reject the principle of sufficient reason or withhold judgment on it, it doesn't mean there is no God, but the cosmological argument won't get you to God, right? So that ends our section on the cosmological argument. Please let me know if you have any questions.